Good day. Today is Tuesday, 28th January 2025, and we are now more than a week away from Donald Trump's inauguration. And perhaps it's useful at this point to ask one simple question. Why has a certain thing that we were promised was going to happen and happened very quickly, happened within days of the inauguration? Why has it not happened at all? And I'm talking about the conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, which was supposed to kick off the dialogue between those two countries and lead to a summit meeting between those two leaders and to attempts to get negotiations between Russia and Ukraine underway. Now, yesterday, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, said that so far, the Russians have received no direct communication from the Americans at all. There's been no word from Trump himself. There's been no call from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. There's been no visit from General Kellogg. In fact, it's not clear to me what General Kellogg currently is doing. He doesn't seem to be going to Kiev. He doesn't seem to be going to Moscow. He doesn't seem to be spending very much time touring European capitals. He gives occasional interviews. But if we follow and track his movements, for the moment at least, he doesn't seem to be doing very much. And President Trump himself seems to be massively engaged in all sorts of things, rolling out executive orders, talking about the end of the green transition, talking about anti-woke policies and things of that kind. But about this leading step in diplomacy that we were told would happen, well, so far we've seen actually no action or movement at all. So far from having the war end on the very first day of Donald Trump's presidency, a week has passed and there's been many comments, many statements. There was Donald Trump's famous statement on Truth Social, in which he appeared to be threatening the Russians with further sanctions. There's been interviews. There's been an awful lot of that kind of thing. But actual diplomatic movement, diplomatic activity to get the dialogue started, to get the war ended, of that so far, we've seen none. Now, there are a number of possible explanations about this. One of them is that Donald Trump is acting on the usual standard classic diplomatic, using the diplomatic technique. He's set out his pitch. He's made certain comments to the Russians. He says he wants the war to end. He says the Russians should want the war to end. He says that it's ultimately up to Putin whether or not the war ends. He's made a number of comments about the enormous losses that the Russians are suffering and the tremendous problems their economy is supposed to be suffering. And it may be that what he thinks is that he doesn't actually have to do anything, that if he remains silent in the White House, if he and his officials take no further step, then sooner or later it will be the Russians who will call. And perhaps using Trump's normal practice as he believes, a master negotiator. Maybe Trump believes that if it is the Russians who initiate the first call, that will put him in a position of psychological advantage over them. It will seem as if they are coming to him and asking him for help, as opposed to he having to contact them, to reach out to them, and to suggest negotiations to them. Well, that is one explanation. And I don't think with a personality like Donald Trump, it can be discounted. I should say that having been involved in many negotiations at various times in my life, I can say that it is actually quite normal for the party that believes itself to be in the stronger position to hold out and remain out of communication and wait for the first step to be taken by the weaker party. The problem, however, obviously, is that, as I've discussed in many programs now, it is a mistake to think that the Russians are actually the weaker party, at least in connection with the situation in Ukraine. Far from being in a weak position, as perhaps Donald Trump believes, they are, and believe themselves to be, in an extremely strong position. Or perhaps it's something else. Perhaps Donald Trump has grasped the point that I made about some of his statements of last week, that they appeared to be conveying to the Russians an excessive anxiety to end the war quickly, and that was actually putting Donald Trump in a weaker position with respect to the Russians than he needed to be in. In which case, perhaps Donald Trump, again, not wanting to convey weakness, has decided that perhaps for the moment at least, it's better to say nothing. It's better to say as little about Ukraine as possible. It's better to let the situation settle down a little, and then maybe at the very end of this month or the beginning of next, then, but not before, begin the dialogue with the Russians. Or there is another possibility, which is that things have not gone quite as Donald Trump intended when he made his comment on Truth Social. Maybe he was surprised at the Russian reaction, the fact that the Russian reaction was so calm and measured, and that he's starting to sense that he's not bringing to the Russians any clear plan that they can work with, or that he can work with them, and that perhaps it would be better to defer further diplomatic initiatives for the time being until he has his own ideas more fully sorted out and has worked out what kind of pitch he's going to make. Now, any one of these explanations, it seems to me, might provide the answer, or it may be that it's a combination of all of them. With a personality like Donald Trump, it's difficult to say. All I will say is this. The Russians are in no hurry to initiate discussions with Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is waiting for the Russians to call, then he might have to accept the fact that that call might not happen for days, weeks, months before any discussion is initiated. Because as far as the Russians are concerned, the situation on the battlefronts continues to shape to their advantage. Their economic situation, far from what you read, is stable. Their relationships with their key allies, the BRIC states, China first and foremost, but India also, is stable. President Lula of Brazil has just confirmed, for example, that he intends to visit Moscow and attend the 9th May Victory Day celebrations in Russia. So for all of these reasons, the Russians have no real reason at the moment to rush after Donald Trump, to ask him to talk to them, to ask him what his ideas are, or any of that kind of thing. So the Russians, who made a decision that they would not telephone and congratulate Donald Trump after his election, they decided that that might invite a rebuff, and could be misconstrued by the media in the United States and might even be embarrassing for Donald Trump. And the Russians, who have made no urgent step to establish contact with Donald Trump after he was inaugurated, well, they've heard that he's had a lot of things to say and a lot of thoughts to share, but for the moment he doesn't seem to be interested in talking to them, so they don't really see why they need to talk to him. Just saying. Anyway, one wonders how long this game is going to continue. At some point, I do expect that the Russians and the Americans will resume contact with each other. Sergei Ryabkov, when he said that there was no communication between the Russians and the Americans, he did say that there are some contacts between embassies, with the embassies, that the Russians are in touch with the American embassy and the Russian embassy in Washington continues to operate. Though, as I understand it, both embassies function with only skeleton staffs and barely operate at all in any normal sense. But anyway, that there is some contact. A couple of days ago, Sergei Naryshkin, the head of the SVR, the Russian intelligence service, said that he was prepared to sit down and have a meeting should Radcliffe wish it with the new CIA chief, Mr. Radcliffe. Now, I think some people misunderstood that to mean that Naryshkin was floating the possibility that the SVR and the CIA be the primary vehicles for conducting negotiations. I don't think that was what Naryshkin intended. I think he simply meant that it's normal. It was a normal thing during the Cold War, and it became a normal thing still more after the Cold War for the intelligence services of Russia and the United States to have contact with each other. This period of the Biden administration, that when contacts were effectively severed, is unusual, and that he was floating the possibility that the contacts be resumed. But in any event, there's been no follow-up from that suggestion from the American side either, and for the moment at least, we see no activity at all. I am going to here venture my own view. Maybe there is some degree of psychological maneuvering, especially on Trump's side. But I think fundamentally what has happened over the last 7 days is that Donald Trump has perhaps started to understand that resolving the war in Ukraine is going to be a much more complicated process than perhaps he initially assumed. He may have gradually come to realize that the Russians are not in the bad position in which he believed them to be in. And it could be that he has also come to realize that the leverage he actually has over the Russians is not that great. And that for the moment, he's retreating from further diplomatic action because he's trying to work out a plan going forward and has come to realize that he doesn't have a viable one at the moment. Now, some governments have noticed this inactivity and they are beginning to show some signs of concern. The Hungarian Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjártó, Hungary having invested a huge amount in a peace initiative between Russia and the United States to end the Ukraine war. Anyway, Foreign Minister Szijjártó has had a telephone call with the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in which he appears to have asked is the United States, in fact, genuinely committed to trying to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end? And the fact that Seattle asked that question strongly suggests to me that in Budapest, Orban and Seattle and the other Hungarian leaders are now beginning to become worried that this inactivity is lengthening, and they're starting to worry about what that means. Well, Rubio went out of his way, apparently, to reassure Seattle that the Trump administration remains committed to achieving peace in Ukraine, that they will do everything they can to achieve that peace, though it's clear from the various readouts that he wasn't able to go into any specifics. Anyway, we will see how much longer, as I said, this strange period lasts. For the moment, obviously, Donald Trump has lots of other things to do. And amongst those things, it's now clear that the purge that is taking place within the foreign policy machinery in Washington continues to gather pace. Now, Mike Waltz apparently has suspended a large number of the staffers of the National Security Council. We had confirmation about that a couple of days ago. And it's perhaps worth pointing out that the National Security Council and one of its officials, Alexander Vindman, played a key role in Donald Trump's first impeachment. And Donald Trump, therefore, perhaps understandably, has reasons to be suspicious of the permanent staff of the National Security Council. Vindman's family, by the way, have expressed feelings of betrayal about the fact that they were not included in Joe Biden's pardons, the number of people pardoned by Joe Biden in the last hours and indeed minutes of Joe Biden's presidency. So Trump might have good reason, as I said, to want to clear out of the National Security Council, and that could be unrelated to the specific topic of Ukraine. But it's worth pointing out that the reason the National Security Council, or at least some of the staff of the National Security Council, started to move against Trump in connection with his first impeachment was precisely because they were unhappy with what they saw as shifts of policy that Trump seemed to be initiating with respect to Ukraine. Specifically, the triggering event for the first impeachment was the first telephone call that has happened between Donald Trump, then President of the United States, and Vladimir Zelensky, at that time the newly elected President of Ukraine. So anyway, there is a purge underway, apparently, in the National Security Council. I appreciate some people in the United States will not take kindly to my use of the word purge, but why not? Anyway, there is a purge apparently underway at the National Security Council. And by the way, given that it seems to be staffed mostly by people with neocon views, I can fully understand why. Quite apart from the personal reasons Donald Trump might have about some of the actions that people who work there once took against him. Just saying. But it seems as if the State Department bureaucracy is now also subject to some kind of a purge as well. Now, we've now had clear confirmation that there is indeed a stop order from Marco Rubio, extending to aid, civilian aid for Ukraine. It appears to go far beyond Ukraine, however. I'm getting reports that not only have civilian programs to most foreign aid recipients been stopped, but USAID, the key NGO that channels funding to the various other NGOs, that forms that huge community of NGOs that the United States runs around the world, and which have been such a central part, such a central plank of its foreign policy, that USAID itself is in turmoil, that funding to USAID has also been cut, and that USAID itself is facing stop orders to stop funding the large numbers of NGOs that function around the world. Now, that is a dramatic development, but I would say that yesterday, Glenn Deason and myself did a program on the Duran, which I would strongly advise you to see, in which we discussed events in Europe and the world with a Hungarian foreign policy analyst, somebody who takes great interest in foreign policy affairs from Budapest, and who Alex Christoforou and I met in Hungary. And this person, you can watch the video, it's going to come out fairly soon, I'm not going to say too much about it. This person mentioned that the Hungarians have detected that Western-backed NGOs in Hungary are also finding themselves cut off from funding. And I've no reason to believe that what is true of Hungary is not true of Georgia, Armenia, Yugoslavia, Slovakia, all of these places where all of these NGOs continue to function. So, given, as I said, the importance of this whole network of NGOs in mounting colour revolutions, influencing opinion in various different countries, shaping opinion in those countries in ways that the leadership of the United States has advocated. This, if it is continued, it's only been underway for a few days, if this is continued, would be a very radical change. So we have that going on, and it seems that there have been objections, that people in the State Department, which ultimately is the supervisory department, are deeply upset and alarmed by what has happened, but it seems that several of them have been suspended as well, and others, some of them have actually resigned. Now, Larry Johnson at Sonar 21, Larry Johnson, of course, former State Department official, former CIA official, member of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and here I disclose, a personal friend of mine. Anyway, Larry Johnson is, of course, far better informed about what is going on in Washington than I am. But he's saying that some very senior people in the State Department, at least one very senior person in the State Department, an assistant secretary, as I understand, has stepped down. And that suggests that there is considerable shock and confusion and a feeling that a change, a real change, is indeed underway. And here it's perhaps worth pointing out that just as, for the moment at least, the Trump people are steering clear of having any direct dialogue with the Russians, and by the way, I can understand why. I explained why I think this is done, that they're stopping and thinking and rethinking what they're going to do. And I think on balance, by the way, if I'm right about that, that would be a good thing. But it's also interesting that the Trump people, the Trump White House, has had no direct contacts that I am aware of with anybody in the European Commission, or, as I believe, even in the NATO bureaucracy as well. I mean, normally, if this had been someone like, say, Obama who had been elected, you would be seeing people like Mark Rutte and Ursula von der Leyen on the plane to Washington, having meetings with Trump and Rubio and all of the others, certainly with the president. But it seems nothing like that for the moment is actually happening. It looks as if, again, these people have been cut off cold. And I would suspect they're very unhappy and worried about it too. So anyway, these are the events that are taking shape. Let me repeat again a point I have made many times on these programs, and it's one that Donald Trump himself needs to remember. If Donald Trump really is looking for a negotiated outcome to the war in Ukraine, he probably doesn't have a huge amount of time. Yesterday, I discussed in my program certain comments that Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, was reported to have made at a top-level meeting in Kiev. Reportedly, and we got these reports from heavyweight Ukrainian media outlets like Ukrainska Pravda, but it was all over the Ukrainian media as of yesterday. Anyway, reportedly, Budanov said Ukraine has about 6 months left when it can continue to fight, and beyond that, it's curtains. Ukraine itself could collapse. And there were even some claims that he said that with a kind of, in a calm voice and with a kind of half smile. Now, I said in my program yesterday that I fully expected that despite the fact that these comments of Budanov have been reported in Ukraine itself by what looked to be very serious and reliable channels, I said that I fully expected that the denials would eventually follow. And sure enough, over the course of yesterday, after I did my program, the denials began to come. Except, of course, it's not quite clear what the news story is. Some say that Budanov didn't speak at all at this meeting. They don't tell us whether he was there, but apparently he didn't speak. Others say that he did speak, but was misunderstood. Still others say that he spoke, but his words were misrepresented. And some further still go on to say that he said some things which were the opposite of what he is reported to have said. Well, all I will say is that it is Budanov himself who is reported to have made those comments, the ones that I discussed yesterday. If they are untrue, if he really didn't say them, then I would have expected that Budanov himself, by now, would have come forward and said as much. The fact that he has not done so, at least not to my knowledge, makes me think that most definitely he did say what I reported him yesterday, or rather what I said yesterday, based on Ukrainian reports that he had said. That Ukraine has about 6 months of fighting left. Beyond that, it's curtains. Well, there's, as it happens, been an article about Ukraine's situation in The Economist. Now, The Economist is perhaps the most hardline neocon magazine on planet Earth. In fact, I would argue that it's been essentially neocon in its outlook since long before the neocons even existed. I've been reading The Economist since the early 1970s, and it has consistently followed the extremely strong anti-Russian, anti-communist, anti-Putin, anti-whatever line that it follows today. And as I said, there's been remarkably little change, hardly any change in format, hardly any change in language. The tone, the manner that it conveys information is pretty much the same. And as you would expect of a magazine like that, it has been a fervid supporter of the Maidan movement in Ukraine, of the Orange Revolution in 2004, of the change of power in Ukraine in 2014, of Ukraine's moves to join NATO, of the policies of the post-2014 Ukrainian governments. It's been a relentless, almost extreme critic of President Putin and of his government. And it has been a passionate supporter of Ukraine throughout the present conflict, the present armed conflict, which began with President Putin's declaration of the SMO almost a year ago in February 2022. Well, recently, in the last couple of weeks, months, The Economist is changing its story. It's becoming much more pessimistic about Ukraine's military future, about where the war is going. And his latest article, in its latest edition, is entitled, "Amid Talk of a Ceasefire, Ukraine's front line is crumbling." And the article begins with pictures of Russian soldiers in Velikaya Novosilka waving their flags. And it's triggered, in fact, by the fall of Velikaya Novosilka under Russian control. Anyway, we read that the Ukrainian armed forces no longer have tactics other than plugging holes by chaotically throwing battalions in. The army has become hamstrung by mass desertions and people's unwillingness to die for the Ukrainian state. We are throwing battalions into a chaotic mess and hope we can somehow stop it, that is to say, the Russian advance, says Kupol, a Ukrainian officer who until September commanded a brigade somewhere in the east. Ukrainian reserves have been hit high by problems of mobilization and desertion. We have Colonel Fedosenko, commander of the Ukrainian tactical grouping in Donbass, complaining, "We are struggling to make up for our losses on the battlefield. They can throw a battalion of soldiers into a position, we manned with 4 or 5 soldiers." So that the Russians have battalions where the Ukrainians can deploy a squad. That's what Colonel Fedosenko says. And we're told by The Economist that the brigades are constantly understaffed, under pressure and cracking, and the front line continues to retreat. Now, all of this comes in conjunction with a fascinating article I read in Al Jazeera by Peter Korotayev and Volodymyr Ishchenko, both Ukrainian commentators. I should quickly acknowledge that I became aware of this article, again, through the good offices of Jeff Roberts, the historian, who circulates articles like this to fortunate people like myself. Anyway, the article reads, "Why is Ukraine struggling to mobilize its citizens to fight?" And the subtitle, which I think only partially reflects the truth, is that many Ukrainians have come to the realization that their state is distributing the burdens and benefits of war unfairly. Now, I should say that of the two writers, I don't know Peter Korotayev, but Volodymyr Ishchenko is one of the finest commentators, in my opinion, that Ukraine has, and he's written fine articles about Ukraine in the past. I can remember once upon a time, ages ago it seems, when you could read articles by Volodymyr Ishchenko in The Guardian, where you would absolutely not find them today. Anyway, the point these two writers make is that Ukraine is a bitterly divided society, deeply polarized on class as well as linguistic lines. The Maidan revolution, I'm not reading the article, I should say, and to some extent, what I'm going to say now is my own interpretation of what the article says. It's not exactly on all fours with what Ishchenko and Korotayev said. But basically, the Maidan revolution can be understood as being propelled forward by an alliance, a coalition of strongly pro-Western, anti-Russian, middle-class Ukrainians, concentrated mainly in Kiev, deeply hostile to Russia, but also in some respects very, very distant from the mass of the Ukrainian population. And Ishchenko and Korotayev have numerous articles, make numerous points about how these people actually feel a fundamental disdain, even contempt for the masses of the Ukrainian people. Anyway, a alliance between these sort of people, what the Russians would call creative intelligentsia, and in Kiev and some of the other big cities, and Western Ukrainian nationalists, who I suspect in Western Ukraine have wider, deeper demographic roots in their own regions. Now, what appears to have happened is that after the war began, there was a few months of apparent national unity. These two groups remained united with each other. There was a flood of volunteers from the West, principally, or so I understand. Middle-class Kiev, the section of the population that in many ways continues to insist on the fiercest prosecution of the war, the group that provides the Ukrainian writers that you read in places like The Guardian and other Western journals, just saying. They, of course, did not join the army. They did not go out and fight, but they remained keen in promoting the battle. The more nationalist, more working class Ukrainians in the West joined in. But elsewhere, across the rest of Ukraine, those Ukrainians who did not feel so motivated to support the Maidan events, who don't share to anything like the same degree these agendas, the people who, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, had come to a kind of understanding with Ukrainian authority, which is that provided the Ukrainian authorities left them alone, they would in turn leave the authorities in Kiev alone. They'd keep their distance. These people now that the original demographic from the West that formed the first volunteers has been exhausted, it is to this larger mass of the Ukrainian population that with each new mobilization, the Ukrainian authorities turn. And this larger mass of the Ukrainian population is not motivated to fight. They see no reason to fight for a state that does not deliver for them. They have no particular feeling of identity with this state, and so they're holding back and are in fact passionately opposed to attempts to mobilize them and throw them into the meat grinder of the war. Now, I think this is probably correct, and it explains further why, despite all of the various mobilization efforts, the Ukrainian lines do in fact continue to crumble. There's just been more reports about another Western trained brigade, which apparently arrived in the Pokrovsk area over the last couple of days. And by the way, I should say that the Ukrainians appear to be trying to conduct some kind of offensives or counterattacks in the Pokrovsk area, specifically in the area of Kotlino, perhaps with these new brigades that they're now trying to transfer to this area. The trouble is, the men, recently mobilized men, who make up these brigades are deeply unmotivated. They're very angry. They've been resentful of the attempts to train them and have barely absorbed the lessons of their training. And as soon as they can escape their units, that is precisely what they do. And I discussed, as we have, Alex Christoforo and I, in recent programs, the question of why Zelensky and Syrskyi, and before that Zelensky and Zaluzhny, insisted on defending every millimeter of Ukrainian territory, literally to the last Ukrainian, refusing to countenance withdrawals. And, well, a certain degree of bloody-mindedness on the part of Zelensky and Syrskyi no doubt played its role previously, and also no doubt there was the deeper feeling that if Ukraine appeared to be conducting major retreats and withdrawals, it would not go down well with the West. But I wonder whether also there is now a hidden understanding that if Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines, recently mobilized Ukrainian soldiers, are allowed to retreat, they will seize the opportunity to simply melt away. That sort of thing has happened in other wars. It happened in Syria recently, just a few weeks ago, when entire Syrian units simply dissolved themselves whenever they were asked to conduct any kind of sophisticated tactical maneuvers. Well, clearly, it's nothing like as bad as that in Ukraine. But perhaps there is some element of nervousness in Kiev that if they do order too many retreats in too many places, the soldiers will decide that the war is lost and that there's no point in fighting. And given how deeply unmotivated and disaffected they are, they will simply come to their own conclusions and melt away. So, anyway, that's one possibility. It is nonetheless the case that despite the fact that there is this crisis on the front lines, we saw it with the fall of Velikaya Novosilka, The Russians today, by the way, have just confirmed that the important village, or rather small town, of Dvorechnoye, west of the Oskol River, has now passed entirely under Russian control. This is actually a small town which functioned as the capital of its own administrative unit until certain reorganizations of the regional system that Ukraine carried out a few years ago. So Dvorechnoye is sometimes referred to by the Russians as a rural community with an urban aspect, just say. And it's probably likely that you will find some high-rise buildings there, and probably a few of the more impressive brick public buildings that the Soviet Union used to build right across the entire territory of the Soviet Union. Anyway, even as the Russians maintain their pressure, as I said, Velikaya Novosilka fell a few days ago. Dvorechnoye has also come fully under Russian control. Nikolaevno Darino in Kursk region has now passed under Russian control. There are more reports of other villages under Russian control. There is a question mark about Toretsk. As I said in my previous program, it looks as if the Ukrainians carried out a spoiler operation there in order to prevent the Russians from declaring that Toretsk had fallen on the same day that Velikaya Novosilka had. But nobody doubts that the Battle of Toretsk is in fact almost entirely ended. Anyway, even as all of this goes on, even as if there are problems with the state of the military across Ukraine, even as the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, dabbles with a conscription law, reducing the conscription age to 18, which, if I'm right in what I have just said, will actually only compound Ukraine's military crisis rather than resolve it. Well, even as all of that goes on, Zelensky and Syrskyi continue much as they always have. They have just, for example, announced the dismissal of the overall commander of the Ukrainian forces in eastern Donbass. This was General Gnatev, who took over from General Sodol just a few months ago. General Sodol having himself taken over from another Ukrainian commander just before then. The Moon of Alabama has a good article about the chaotic nature of Ukraine's entire command structure and about the many shifts and changes of command that there have been since even before the special military operation began. And anyway, they continue, Syrskyi and Zelensky continue to replace generals. The game of musical chairs with the generals continues as it always has. Perhaps partly this reflects a degree of political insecurity as well. You don't want a general to establish too strong a connection with the men he's commanding and with the headquarters that he is commanding, lest he use that position to start exerting pressure in Kiev itself. After all, that was what happened with General Zaluzhny. General Zaluzhny built up a strong clientage system within the Ukrainian military, and it proved very, very difficult for Zelensky to remove him, even when he made finally made that decision. Anyway, Zelensky and Syrski continue to play the game of musical chairs with their generals. But Zelensky has just also made another really quite extraordinary speech, which, to my mind, again, calls into question the entire theory that he's seriously interested in negotiations at all. He revisits again for the umpteenth time the question of the Budapest memorandum. He continues to repeat that Ukraine was forced by the great powers to surrender its nuclear weapons. I have explained this any number of times, as have any number of others, that this story is not true, that it is complete fiction, that Ukraine never at any time had control of nuclear weapons. There were Soviet nuclear weapons forming part of the Soviet nuclear arsenal stationed on Ukrainian territory when the Soviet Union collapsed. The soldiers who were in control of those nuclear weapons continued to receive their orders from their central headquarters in Moscow. And what the Budapest memorandum was about repatriating these nuclear weapons back to Russia, removing them from the territory of Ukraine and transferring them back to the state to which they originally belonged. Just saying. Anyway, Zelensky once again comes up with this. He is saying that it was a terrible mistake, despite all the pressure that Ukraine was subjected to, for Ukraine to surrender its nuclear weapons. And Zelensky also said that now that the nuclear weapons have gone, well, Ukraine needs the guarantee of a very strong army, a very big and very, very strong army, because the Russians are always there. They will always be predatory. They will always represent a threat to Ukraine so long as Russia exists. And Zelensky, along with other East European leaders from the Baltic states and Poland and other places, has at times floated ideas about what a good thing it would be if somehow something could be arranged whereby Russia should cease to exist. Just saying. But anyway, accepting that Ukraine might not be able to sustain a huge army by itself indefinitely, Zelensky then came back and said that, of course, what Ukraine will need in order to secure itself are firm security guarantees, and the only reliable one is membership of NATO. Now, that goes wholly against all ideas, all proposals that we have seen up to now from the Americans and from the Russians to end the war. The various plans and ideas that have originally come from Washington, apparently from General Kellogg and from his people, and of course Putin's own June 2024 proposals. Zelensky still says he wants NATO membership. He still even floats the possibility that Ukraine might once again become a nuclear power. He wants Ukraine to have very powerful armed forces, armed and equipped by the West. And he also wants European troops stationed in Ukraine as well, to act as a tripwire force, setting the stage for that war. He will no doubt arrange a war between the West and Russia, out of which he presumably expects a reunified Ukraine to emerge and a defeated and perhaps partitioned Russia to be the result. So I don't see any evidence that Zelensky or Sirski or any of these officials have any real ideas to change their mind. Now, if we go back to yesterday's report, yesterday's comments about Budanov, I said that it seemed to me too much of a coincidence that Budanov's words that Ukraine was going to lose the war by the summer unless there was a peace agreement, that those words should have appeared at precisely the time when a document purporting to set out a peace agreement is supposed to be circulating, which has been reported by the Strana website. And in the following hours, what looks like a very similar plan also started to circulate in the Turkish media as well. Now, it could be that they're taking some of their information from Strana, but Turkey has close relations with Ukraine, and it's a reasonable guess that the same people who briefed Strana about this plan, which they're attributing to the Americans, have also been briefing the Turks. The proposals are not exactly identical. They're not on all fours, but there are certain overlaps, which leads me to think that it's the same group of people who are busy now circulating these ideas as well. They appeared in Strana, perhaps in order to attract American and European attention. Strana is far too narrow a publication for that to really succeed. So now an attempt has been made to try to publish it in the Turkish media instead. Now, all of that taken together, if it is indeed the case that these ideas are originating from Kiev, from people within the political class in Kiev, all of that suggests to me that there is indeed now the start of a power struggle of some kind underway. Because the Zelensky, no doubt, has linked his political survival to the prolongation of the war and looks incapable of conducting negotiations. By the way, in the same comments, he insisted that if negotiations between the Americans and the Russians should take place, then Ukraine needed to be a part of those negotiations. As Anatol Lieven correctly said a short time ago in Responsible Statecraft, if that happens, if Zelensky is allowed a voice in the negotiations, then it is highly likely that the negotiations will get nowhere. But anyway, it seems to me that the fact that there's talk about negotiations, the fact that people can see that the situation on the front lines, as The Economist says, is crumbling. The front line is crumbling. The Ukrainian armed forces no longer have tactics other than plugging holes by chaotically throwing in battalions. I can't help but think that some people in Kiev, seeing that the writing is on the wall, are saying to themselves that this simply has gone too far. It can't go on. Another leader must take Zelensky's place, and negotiations with the Russians hopefully with the Americans on board, must begin. Now, something rather like this did almost happen in the spring of 2024, as I remember, a year ago, just over a year, under a year ago. At that time, the Ukrainian offensive of the summer of 2023 had been a disastrous failure. Hit pieces started to appear against Zelensky, for example, by Simon Schuster in Time magazine. There were complaints from the military about irrational and illogical orders, and a power struggle played out between Zelensky and his then military chief, General Zelensky. Now, it became clear over the course of the spring of 2024, that Zelensky still had the backing of the Western powers, the British, the Biden administration, and the Europeans. And that, of course, ensured that in that particular power struggle, he survived. He came out on top. But now, with a new administration in the White House, it could be that the political geometry has changed, that the Americans are no longer so supportive anymore. Trump has said that Zelensky is no angel. He's spoken of him as the greatest salesman in existence, implying that Zelensky was running a kind of con to get the Americans to release their tax dollars to him. He said that during the election itself. I wonder whether Zelensky's political support in the West is quite as strong now as it once was. Well, I don't know, but I'm going to make a guess that at some point over the next few weeks, when the battle for Pokrovsk begins, and especially if Pokrovsk falls, then a political crisis in Kiev, one which might finally sweep Zelensky away, is not to be discounted. Information about the crumbling front lines, appearing in places like The Economist, the realities about the critical state of Ukraine's army, these extraordinary words of Budanov, which have not been satisfactorily contradicted. All of this points to a political crisis in Kiev if Zelensky himself continues to dig in and continues to act as a major obstacle towards negotiations. Now, saying all of this, it's important to reiterate further that if Zelensky does go, if the political setup in Kiev changes, if there's some kind of reshuffle or coup which leads to Zelensky being removed from the scene, well, it's far from guaranteed that this will stabilize the situation in Ukraine or open the way for negotiations. It could be, we might even discover, that without Zelensky, whatever remaining remnants of stability exist in the system have been swept away with him. And we could see a deepening crisis and a gradual breakdown of authority across Ukraine. That might also open the way for military coups and things of that kind. After all, to repeat a point I've made in the past, that was what happened following the overthrow in 1963 in an American-backed coup of President Diem in Vietnam. The Americans thought that by removing Diem, the situation in South Vietnam would be stabilized. In fact, it was destabilized still further. So we'll see anyway where it goes. But for the moment, the war goes on. The Russians continue to advance. There's been some stories that there's been a pause, a kind of pause in the fighting over the last 36 hours. I think that is most unlikely. I've seen reports of pauses in the fighting before. I think that almost invariably they are a sign that the various agencies, the Ukrainians and the Russians, are tightening up reporting from the battlefronts, most of which, it must be remembered, ultimately originates with information provided by soldiers, by battlefront soldiers. That's where the various reporting projects and the mapping projects get their information. So I suspect that both the Russians and the Ukrainians, for completely different reasons, following the fall of Velikaya Novosilka, have tightened up information flows. It's happened many times over the course of this war. And this is giving a false picture of a quieter period in the war, whereas in fact I see no actual real evidence of this. What we don't have are the same details that we often do, but usually when this pause lifts, when the information becomes more readily available, we find that there have indeed been significant movements, and nearly always they are movements in the Russian direction. In other words, things have been moving further the way the Russians want to take them. Now, coming back to Donald Trump and his negotiating strategy, I think it is probably wise to take a couple of days or a week or two off from Ukraine, sit back, think it through, then arrange the call with Putin, then meet with Putin after things have died down a little, then come back after the meeting with Putin. And once there's been a clearer understanding of the Russian position, I think then it might be the better moment to start launching some serious diplomatic initiatives. It is also the case that Pete Hegseth, the new Defence Secretary who's just been installed, needs to take charge and sort out his team. He probably has, in General Brown, a chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff he's not comfortable with, for example. And it may be that the administration and Pete Hegseth will want to try and arrange for General Brown, who has been an invisible presence, by the way, throughout this war, to, shall we say, take early retirement. just saying. But the point I'm making, and I've said it many times and I want to say it again, there isn't unlimited time. Unless, of course, the Trump administration's actual strategy on Ukraine is to run out the clock, to do as little as possible, to engage in the appearance of discussions about how to end the war, and to allow Ukraine to collapse at its own pace. Maybe that is the strategy. I can't quite believe that. I can't quite believe that Donald Trump would prefer a situation where Ukraine just falls apart without him at least doing something in order to avert what many would see around the world as a major American geopolitical defeat. But if I'm right, then Donald Trump needs to understand that he has perhaps 2-3 weeks, a month at most, in order to get things started. he's set himself 100 days. Those 100 days are already being used up, as I said, with very little actual happening. And it could be that after those 100 days, once those 100 days are past us, well, that will be 3 months out of the 6 months that Budanov is giving Ukraine. And there might not be very much that can be done in those 3 months. And of course, the Russians, if they feel that they're in a position of advantage, might feel disinclined to do very much in those 3 months. And of course, if there is an unfolding crisis in Kiev itself, well, that will make launching a diplomatic initiative at that period even more difficult than it would otherwise be. So, anyway, we will see what Donald Trump and his people do. Meanwhile, the media headlines over the last 24 hours have been dominated by a completely different story from the United States, in the United States, but one which I am peculiarly unqualified to discuss intelligently. Suffice to say, as I'm sure most of you know, there's been apparently absolute shock and horror across the entire vast American information technology, AI technology industry, which is worth hundreds of, probably trillions of dollars by now. Anyway, there's been absolute shock that the Chinese company operating with a fraction of the budget. I saw someplace that they have only 5% of the budget of the analogous American agency, came up with some kind of AI program or app, which apparently does pretty much all of the things that the immeasurably more expensive, vastly more complicated, massively more heavily resourced American app or program or whatever it is does. And this has created shockwaves, not just within the technological universe of, the big tech companies and all of that, but it's had a massive impact on the stock market in the United States. There's been some kind of crash, and Donald Trump obviously has had to come forward and has had to speak out and try to calm nerves and say, look, this isn't something for us to worry about. It's a wake-up call. By the way, I thought his response to this event was a wise one. But anyway, I have very little to say about this, and I'm not going to devote time to it. All I'm going to say is this. Not for the first time in my lifetime, the Americans have been caught by surprise by the discovery that others are as advanced in their science and in their engineering as they are. That they're able to do things sometimes with far fewer resources and do them as well as the Americans themselves can do. And whenever this happens, this comes as a huge shock. The biggest shock, apparently, post-war, happened before my lifetime when the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, which was Sputnik 1. But it's happened repeatedly. It happened a few years ago when the Chinese, through some means that has not yet been fully explained, by the way, at least not that I'm aware of, produced their own ultra-advanced computer chip, comparable to those produced in Taiwan. And again, there was shock and grief and lots of discussion about how did the Chinese do this. And there was all sorts of people reassured each other that the Chinese were using less efficient lithography machines in ways that was enormously expensive and wasteful and all of that, and they hadn't really mastered the production technology properly, which for all I know is true, by the way, but I'm not sure quite what a difference it makes. The point is that this constant assumption that the Americans tend to have, that when it comes to technology and science, they're streets ahead of everyone else, that this is somehow their major inbuilt advantage, that they can shape the future because they shape the science and they own the technology, and that others aren't anywhere close to them. That seems to me to have absolutely no basis in reality at all. For at least the last century, humanity has been living, as far as I'm concerned, in a single technological and scientific universe. For most of that century, the United States has been far and away the richest and best organized state in the world, and certainly within that technological world. That has meant that the Americans have often had head starts because they've been able to take scientific ideas, which are widely known and well understood by many people, and they're able to organize and bring the resources to bear to make those technologies to fruition, to bring them to fruition, and to make them work more quickly than others can. But repeatedly, what happens is that others catch up. And of course, today, we are in a different economic universe altogether, in the sense that it is no longer true that the United States is by far the richest and best organized state within the global system. China today can at least match the resources that the United States has in order to throw at a problem. And of course, it can draw on help from its allies, the Russians, who, contrary to what many persist in believing, remain themselves a major technological and scientific power. So, if America believes that the future is in AI, they're probably right. I'm not going to push back against it. I don't know one way or the other. I'm not going to pretend that I do and make myself pretend that I know more about these things than I really do. But it may be that the future is in AI. But it is facile to think that the United States or any one country, China as well, by the way, will be able to control it in the way that some people in the United States appear to think. So there we are. That is my own take of this extraordinary story. It's another example of overweening self-delusion. It perhaps does have a geopolitical significance in the sense that I think if Americans are gambling on technology to secure their global hegemony, then they're gambling badly. Any technological advance the Americans make will very quickly be matched by analogous advances amongst their adversaries. So just saying, I mean, that's been the consistent story, certainly since the Second World War. And anyway, put all that aside. It's not, as I said, a topic I feel comfortable talking about. And I've said all that I'm going to say about it. And from now on, and in future programs, I'm going to return to those other things: diplomacy, economics, political struggle, and of course war, which one way or the other I have a better understanding of. Well, this is where I finish my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms. Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.